Hello, Foundryman! Exclamation point. Alex has just released his incredible video about DLSS on the Switch 2, which made me somewhat curious about DLSS from incredibly low internal resolutions and maybe more generally upscaling from low internal resolutions using high quality upscaling solutions like DLSS or FSR4, which is perhaps most relevant on handheld gaming devices. With a number of Z1 and Z2 Extreme devices coming out or already out, what tips can we take from the Switch 2 in how to optimize games for these devices? Should we use post-process sharpening to make the overall perceived image quality better? Do you think there is space for a quote-unquote lightweight FSR4 model, or would that just be FSR 3.1? Thank you for your time. This one from Jats Cracker. I often get the idea that maybe some of these usernames are just designed to be read out to make me look stupid, but maybe not. Anyway, good day, gents. AMD's handheld chips desperately need a better upscaler. With the testing Rich is doing on the FSR4 INT 8 version, do you see it being viable, or does AMD need an FSR4 Mini like Switch 2 and DLSS? Let's quickly talk about some of the testing I've done. I've sent some videos to Oliver here for inclusion, but then, basically what we're seeing here is the Asus ROG Ally at 30 watts running at 720p and then 1080p, and we've got native 720p and then 720p with FSR3 AA, native AA, and then FSR4. And basically what you're seeing here is the same internal resolution, but then you can see the frame rate drop with FSR3 and FSR4, and that drop, quantify that drop, and you've got the cost of FSR3 and FSR4 respectively. So let's take a look at the numbers. This is basically the cost of that on the Asus ROG Ally 30 watts there. FSR3 at 720p, the cost of it is 1.8 milliseconds of render time. Now bear in mind 60 frames per second, 16.7 milliseconds of frame time overall, 30 frames per second, 33.3. I'd say that 1.8 milliseconds is actually quite reasonable. FSR4, however, that goes up to 3.34 milliseconds. So FSR4 is considerably heavier, like 50% or whatever. Let's talk about 1080p now. Using FSR3 just for anti-aliasing adds an additional 4.5 milliseconds to the frame time there, and it's plus 7.4 milliseconds on FSR4. Now, obviously, you're not going to be using those things on a handheld at native resolution. You're going to be basically running up much lower resolutions, but that cost, 7.4 milliseconds of FSR4, you've basically got to claw back via lower internal resolutions much more than 7.4 milliseconds to make it worthwhile. Which basically says to me that, this version of FSR4 that we have, it is early. It wasn't supposed to get out to the general public. It works fine on the desktop side of things, but maybe the cost is quite significant, too significant maybe for a handheld device. But, who knows really how it's actually going to be deployed by AMD. What we have had of statements from AMD saying that they really want to have FSR4 working on handhelds. It works, but it's extremely heavy. But what do you make of this concept in general, Oliver?
In general, I think that something like FSR4 can be very expensive on handhelds, like you point out here. I think even just the cost of regular FSR2 or 3 can be prohibitive on kind of regular handhelds, like not Strix Halo, i.e. not Strix Halo. When you look at something like even the Steam Deck, when you're targeting a 720p output or 800p output with FSR2 or 3, the cost can be, in many cases, such that you can't really get that much of an advantage relative to native res rendering. Even on something like a ROG Ally device, on a Z1 Extreme ROG Ally device, the cost there can be fairly prohibitive for 1080p rendering unless you're pumping up the TDP quite a bit. So I think in general, this kind of approach that we need to have, probably for those devices, it's more of like an FSR mini style approach. When you do look at the Switch 2 there, obviously you're seeing great results out of a console that is using, in Alex's words, a pretty poor upscaler relative to its PC alternatives. I think it's not doing a very good job. For instance, Alex is pointing out, it's not really doing any anti-aliasing or upscaling when objects are in motion, when things are in motion. That's not very good. In stills, it delivers very good image quality, but obviously in motion, that's quite critical. So I think yeah, in general, having cheaper upscaling would help a great deal. FSR4 is not militating in that direction. FSR4 feels like a technology that's more suitable for like these higher TDP modes, maybe like a strict Halo device. Alternatively, one kind of compromise you could make with an upscaler like FSR4, which is higher quality but lower performance, is to accept sub-native upscaling in some cases. So, going to 720p instead of 1080p. 1080p is still a pretty high resolution for these handhelds, I'd venture, unless you're looking at the strict Halo devices, which are kind of a new category of performance well above existing handheld consoles, handheld devices, rather.
Right.
But sub-native upscaling can look good on Switch 2, like we've seen from titles like Street Fighter 6, can look pretty acceptable there. So I think that's another avenue for improving performance. But I kind of don't think, based on your existing testing here, that FSR4 is going to be like this super clean handheld win that people are expecting, especially if you look at existing upscalers. It's not a super easy performance win necessarily in every case.
I also think you can't
right.
just judge this stuff on the face of it based on what we see with larger screen displays, right? Like the one I always go back to is the way Tekken 8 works on Steam Deck, where I find that using something like TSR at a lower resolution produces a better perceivable image than FSR 2 at a higher resolution, both targeting 720p, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like you wouldn't necessarily always expect those types of results on a large monitor, but when you're playing on a handheld screen, like your view of what is acceptable changes, I feel. And sometimes combinations of settings can look different, basically. So I haven't actually had a lot of luck with FSR2 in the Steam Deck, to be honest. I think its specific type of artifacts have been more visible than say what TSR has done.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Another sort of visualization here, I haven't sent it to Oliver yet, but I think I will, is just to show that, looking at this Cyberpunk benchmark, for example, if you sort of scale back FSR4 from FSR4 quality to FSR performance, there's still not a huge degree of win there, to be honest, compared to native rendering resolution. So looking at the Cyberpunk benchmark, this is actually medium settings, and we've basically got 55 frames per second, 720p native. And FSR4 performance, 66 frames per second, which is like 20% performance advantage over native resolution rendering. That's not particularly great, is it? That's not a huge game-changing win. And that's using, a 30-watt configuration there. So maybe there is a case for a sort of lighter weight version. I'm also thinking about the PlayStation Handheld, of course. Of course, it could well be the case that the PlayStation Handheld will just be very, very good at machine learning. We're expecting that, right? So maybe the computational cost of an FSR4 equivalent would be considerably less impactful than it is on an RDNA 3.5 device there. I don't know. What did you make of Alex's video there, Oliver? Because bearing in mind you've done the lion's share of Switch 2 testing, particularly on games like Star Wars Outlaws and stuff like that. I mean, and again, with your testing with Fast Fusion there, John, I mean, you kind of showed that DLSS wasn't really sort of a magic bullet, and we kind of now know why. It seems to be the case that in motion, there's not much upscaling and there's not much anti-aliasing happening with this sort of tiny DLSS. Even so, I don't know. It's not as if we had a huge amount of complaints about Star Wars Outlaws image quality, but, compared to standard DLSS, it's clearly a lot worse.
And honestly, if you're talking about fast, again, there was the whole thing where they added that pure mode, which got rid of all those features entirely. And it didn't look great. It still looked worse in motion than the DLSS did. So there's still something going on there. But fundamentally, yes, as Alex kind of deduced, the main benefits of the DLSS are only really visible when you're not moving. And as soon as you hop into motion, I mean, it's almost like they planned for the screen to be as blurry as it is to hide these issues.
That was my response to when I talked to Alex, but having first viewed the video, it's like, well, actually, this tiny DLSS kind of should look pretty good on a handheld screen, because when everything's in motion, you're losing most of the clarity anyway.
Yep. It reminds me, I mentioned this to you, it reminds me of what they did with Killzone on PS Vita, You recall where like the image quality jumped back up to native res when you stopped moving, and then it would
because you would notice the frame rate drop,
right? And then it would like drop as soon as you start moving, essentially. And it was pretty cool, actually. It worked okay. So I don't know. Interesting.
Any final thoughts, Oliver?
No, I think it's a little bit tricky to evaluate because it is like a low quality upscaling solution relative to anything that exists on PC, relative to anything that exists on console, any kind of traditional, temporal upscaling technique that we see on those platforms. But in titles like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, titles like Fast Fusion, titles like The Tourist, different kinds of games here, I think you would rather have DLSS than not have it, even in this limited form.
Absolutely.
And I do like having a pixel precise match in some content or a high resolution upscale on some content, going to 1440p docked, going to 1080p handheld. That's not really possible with the regular DLSS model. So I think for this specific low power use, it can be good. And, if you have motion blur in there, maybe the breakup isn't so noticeable. In some games, it depends on the art, right? If you have like a lot of high frequency detail, a lot of foliage, things like this. In Hogwarts Legacy, for instance, it's going to break up pretty badly. But in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, it's actually reasonably clean looking in a lot of respects. You just get that extra edge detail. You don't get so much of that fizzling. So it looks pretty decent in that case, I would say.